welcome everyone. It's so lovely to see you here this afternoon. Welcome also to those who are joining us online. And thank you for coming out today for this important conversation about risk, security, and democracy. My name is Suzanne Schneider. In my normal life, I'm a historian and political theorist who teaches at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research in New York City, where I also serve as the deputy director. But I've been lucky to spend a sabbatical year here in Oxford at Magdalen College and at St. Anthony's, and to work on a new book project about risk as a form of social and political logic. And this brings us closer to why I'm here with you today. We often take risk for granted as something that just exists, much like gravity. I know I did prior to beginning this research. Risk has multiple overlapping meanings, from the ideologization of entrepreneurs as risk takers to notions of financial risk and reward on the one hand, to what I think has become the more common usage today, which is some sort of potential harm or danger. What all of these definitions have in common is the element of futurity, the idea that risk calculations and mitigation frameworks all involve trying to forecast and plan for a future that we cannot know with any certainty. We'd like to think that sophisticated risk models, which utilize mathematical probability, eliminate some of the guesswork that goes into fortune telling. But a closer look at the models themselves and the data that power them, the assumptions that they reinforce, often serves to dispel this confidence. Risk assessment and mitigation is often spoken of as an applied science. And science is a term that is laden, of course, with meaning and power. But the more apt comparison might be with early modern astrology. This is not to demean the astrologers, mind you, whose craft was far more rigorous and quantitative than contemporary manifestations in the supermarket checkout lane would suggest. Rather, it's to insert a plea for humility before a future we cannot know, and to think about risk as a particular form of social and political logic that requires interrogation. To that end, over the last 2 days, and thanks to the generous support of the Calleva Centre at Magdalen, I've convened a workshop called Risk Reconsidered: Theories, Histories, and Applications, that brought together 22 scholars working on different aspects of risk from a wide range of disciplines, from economics and climate science to history, bioethics, sociology, politics, and engineering, just to name a few. Workshop participants have tackled issues that may seem discrete at first, from the rise of the stock market to the pricing of insurance premiums, the role of affect and perception in shaping risk assessment, and the way that patients navigate risk in healthcare settings. But our conversations have uncovered deep structural connections between these different articulations of what Ulrich Beck termed the risk society. Today, we're pleased to bring some of these deliberations out of the seminar room and into the public sphere, and in particular, to zero in on a problem. If the production and management of risk has become a defining characteristic of 21st century life, what implications follow for democratic governance? Now, risk is rarely conceived of in these terms as a problem for democracy, but I think there's a good reason to start. Many of our presentations over the last 2 days spoke to fundamental tensions between risk and democratic life, and here I'll name just a few. Risk seems chiefly concerned with liability rather than security, with shifting burdens rather than eliminating or sharing them. Are these frameworks, which grew out of the private sector, an appropriate approach to generating security at a broad basis within democratic societies? In my own work, I draw attention to a fundamental mismatch that obtains between the collective dangers that people face, whether they relate to climate change, finance, healthcare, or crime, and the individualistic tools they are offered to address them. The assumed subject of contemporary social life is thus someone I call the actuarial self, who proceeds with vigilance at all times, who has learned, in short, to serve as their own private risk assessor. By encouraging actors to think of security as a matter of personal responsibility, rather than as a public right that must be generated at the social level, such approaches to assessing and mitigating risk reproduce and further entrench existing social, economic, and political inequalities. The result is not a world in which we are all safer, but one in which those of privileged positions are better insulated from the evolving crises. We need to remember that risk can be, like the COVID-19 pandemic revealed, both universal and unevenly experienced. These tensions, I would say, exist at the global level as well. Our colleague Mikhail, who's here with us today, spoke earlier about the role of tech companies, for instance, in the Ukraine war, and the broader issue of war waged via algorithm. These algorithmic systems are so complicated that they exceed the capacities of lay people or even government officials to understand, to say nothing of control them. In other words, these tools are developed to contend with risk, but end up creating new ones. In this case, the form of private sector violence that cannot be easily controlled by democratic means. Across the board, we find that the ways we manage risk represent a massive, yet almost wholly under-theorized problem for democratic life. We have a wonderful group of scholars gathered here today to speak to these questions, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, but I first want to tell you something about how we envision this event. I decided to call it a public conversation, and that's precisely the goal, to showcase that these questions are thorny, multifaceted, and unresolved, and to provide a space for exchange with members of the general public. Our speakers have not prepared lengthy remarks, or any, in fact. I've rather charged them with something a bit more challenging, and I quote, to hoover up the insights and questions that emerge from the workshop, think them through the lens of their own work, and share those reflections. So now I get to introduce our speakers, qua vacuum cleaners, each of who represents one key piece of the risk universe. So sitting to my far left, Charles Vincent is Emeritus Fellow at Jesus College and Professor of Psychology at the University of Oxford. His work focuses on risk management, patient safety, and assessing the quality of care within the NHS. Greta Krippner, reading to my left, is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan. Her work explores the history and long-term individualization of financial risk in the United States from the perspective of historical, economic, and political sociology. Immediately to my right is Emil Torres, a PhD candidate in philosophy at Leibniz Universität Hannover and a prominent commentator on emerging technologies. Their work focuses on the application of risk frameworks to the future of humanity and tracing the intellectual history of long-termism. Moving one over, Mikael Vedby Rasmussen is Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Copenhagen and a former official in the Danish Ministry of Defense. His research focuses on how conceptions of risk have influenced military strategy over time, including in the war in Ukraine. And last but not least, to my far right, Andrew Sterling is Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the University of Sussex. His work explores frameworks of risk with respect to globally pressing issues, including emerging biotechnologies, energy policy, and the state of democracy. So before we get to the conversation, a few thank yous are in order. First, to the Calleva Centre for sponsoring the workshop and enabling us all to be together this week. I particularly want to thank Calleva's director, Robert Gilbert, who's been so supportive of this project, and Hampton Gaddy, who has provided all of the behind-the-scenes support required to actually make it happen. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to Jean-Charles here at the Martin School for agreeing to partner with Calleva, for helping us identify participants for the workshop, and for hosting us, of course, in this beautiful venue today. And finally, I want to thank the entire Martin School staff, Hannah and Clara especially, for working to organize this conversation. So thank you to everyone who's been involved with this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles, who's going to share a few very quick opening reflections, and we're going to go down the line and go from there.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. As Suzanne said, my work's on healthcare, which obviously is fantastically, wonderfully and beneficial for us all. But sometimes things go wrong and the system fails us, and this is where my work lies. But today, I want to focus on what you might call the challenges of being a patient. One of the themes I took from the workshop was that many things that were previously done by experts or by organizations who looked after us have now been passed over to us, and Greta will give some examples on this, but you know, we manage our own pensions, we manage lots of things about banking, for instance, that used to be much more taken care of by people, you know, whose job was to do that. Now, the risk in healthcare is becoming ever more sophisticated, harder to understand, and by risks we have to estimate ourselves as patients. Often we have to choose between the benefits of certain courses of actions and the risks and weigh up, you know, should we have this or that treatment? You know, should we stop drinking? Should we do this and that? And risk factors occur at every stage. in our lifestyles, in treatment choices, and also actually when we go into hospital, the risk of being in hospital at all. So there's a lot to think about. I suppose a few decades ago, if you like, you'd have gone to a doctor or nurse and you'd have expected them just to sort of tell you what to do. And still, you can ask them to recommend. But increasingly, they've been, with good reason, we as patients or our family members are, if you like, empowered. We're consent, we decide for ourselves. The healthcare professionals are meant to take our own values and preferences into account. Now, there's lots of good things about that, but it also faces us with trying to sometimes understand if you've got prostate cancer, should you have surgery, should you have hormone treatment, whatever it is, should you just do nothing? What are the options and how do you decide what's the right thing for you? This can face you with quite a challenge, and also a challenge for your doctor or whoever is talking to you about how to explain it and how to translate this complex world. I think also this is going to be fresh challenges for us as patients and families as more care comes into the home. Already we have things called hospital at home. We have increasingly trying to deliver care in the home. This is good. Which of us, most of us would like to be at home if we're ill rather than have to go into hospital. But we as patients and families, more and more care is going to the home. And sometimes people are taking over things like managing stomach, feeding through the stomach, or wound care, or even tracheostomies, or really quite complex things that were done mostly by nurses in the past. And so family members are sometimes having to learn quite complex clinical tasks. And I think this is also going to sometimes create problems of equity. This is fine if you've got a nice house and money and you can afford space, but the environments for home care are not the same in all people's houses. So I think this is going to pose challenges for standards and thinking, how far do we go in this direction? Is this going to be regulated? And lots of the problems, the wider problems of risk that we were talking about. So I think that's enough of an introduction for me.
Thank you.
So thanks for including me in this event. Very pleased to be part of the conversation. We've been asked to think about the relationship of risk and democratic governance across a variety of domains. And since I've written about the financialization of the economy and related topics involving the evolution of risk-bearing in advanced capitalist societies, I'll take my domain for purposes of this panel to be finance. And here I can say that the relationship between developments in the financial sector of the economy, the evolution of risk, and prospects for democratic governance are clear, direct, and very worrisome. If we think of financialization as the growing importance of financial sector activities and profits in the economy, we can locate the origins of the turn to finance in an earlier crisis of democratic governance beginning in the late 1960s. Post-war growth had begun to stall across Western economies in this period, resulting in intensifying political conflict over how to distribute more limited resources among competing social priorities. When the institutions of democratic governance proved unequal to the task of resolving these conflicts, policymakers turned instead to credit markets, alleviating immediate budget constraints, but also encouraging a massive expansion of the financial sector that happened first and most dramatically in the US, to be followed by other countries in Europe and across the globe. The basic dynamics of the system are now well known. Heavy reliance on credit to patch over stagnating incomes in the labor market, avoiding the distributional conflicts of earlier eras, but at the cost of increased financial fragility and vulnerability to crisis in the system as a whole. When these crises strike, they make clear that the risk in this system is not borne equally, but falls most heavily on those least able to protect themselves from financial shocks. And we've seen this over and over again in recent decades. So we've been asked today whether systems of risk management could be made more democratic. In the case of the financial system, the answer from a purely technical perspective is clearly yes, as the tools necessary to tamp down excessive growth in credit markets are available and widely known. Cutting financial markets down to size would mean relying more on taxation and fiscal policy to allocate resources in society, domains that are subject to democratic accountability, at least of a certain sort. The more difficult issues here are not, in fact, technical, but concern the political will to re-regulate financial markets. And here there's less reason for optimism. The lack of political will reflects not only the political power of the financial lobby, banks that are too big to fail, and consumer buy-in to a bloated financial sector. It also, in my view, even more fundamentally, reflects that policymakers have themselves become dependent on large liquid financial markets to execute policy, itself a paradoxical outcome of financialization. The intertwining of state and financial markets makes democratic risk management more difficult to achieve, barring some major crisis that cause policymakers to reevaluate current procedures. Given recent events with recurrence of banking failures and the resurgence of inflation, we might think this crisis is closer than we think. So perhaps we're at that moment. I can elaborate on these points, and I'm happy to, but I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there and pass it on to Jeppe.
Hi, you can hear me? Great. So I took away a number of things from the workshop. You know, there's a multiplicity of different approaches to, multiplicity of different approaches to thinking about risk. Our notion of, you know, risk has evolved, you know, quite a bit over time. And in fact, my talk was specifically on existential risk, which is a sort of new concept of risk that has been developed over the past 20 years. And just to keep my initial remarks somewhat succinct, I think my provocation would be that, you know, throughout history, of course, I think this is one point that Beck had made as well. You know, individuals have faced, you know, all sorts of risks in the world, of course, but these days, there does seem to be something that is qualitatively unique about our situation. You know, we're facing a growing number of threats that are, you know, global scale, and, you know, potentially could have repercussions that affect not just, you know, one or two generations, but maybe generations, you know, hundreds of years into the future. So, you know, we've got, you know, the continuing threat of nuclear conflict, climate change, of course. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, you know, artificial superintelligence or artificial general intelligence, been in the news a lot recently. So it does, you know, we seem to be in this situation where the 21st century looks to be an obstacle course of, you know, completely unprecedented threats. So how then do we navigate this obstacle course, and how do we do it in a democratic manner? I feel like these are, you know, really crucial open questions right now.
And that, of course, should leave us with an agenda for the entire afternoon, so I don't really need to say anything. But if I should add something to that, then normally you think of defense and security policy as something which is a very distinct policy area. It's done in a very specific way, by people in uniform, in closed rooms, which are very different from other ways in which we do public policy or democracy. But that's really not the case. And I think if this workshop have demonstrated one thing to me, it is that basically the way we think about risk in healthcare, in finance, or in larger public works, or in the way you handle the war in Ukraine, many of the logics are the same. Which is a relief from a democratic perspective, because then some of the ways in which we engage publics in a democratic debate on security policies isn't that different from how we do it elsewhere. But it's perhaps also a cause of concern. You mentioned the 21st century as an obstacle course. Well, the first one is right outside Kiev. And what has been going on for the last 2 years is an attempt by the West to manage the war in Ukraine by risk management. An attempt by the government in the Kremlin to increase the risk of Western involvement, suggesting that this might end in a nuclear war, that would destabilize the entire European security order, while the West has been insisting that that risk could be managed in ways where it was possible to increase support for the Ukrainian people, while at the same time engaging in a war which would not end in the final catastrophe in a nuclear exchange. And a lot of the political game of this has been whether the West was able to manage that risk, or whether that risk would go out of hand. And then added in other kinds of environmental risk. Russian soldiers deciding to dig trenches outside Chernobyl in the exclusion zone. The nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine consistently threatened with perhaps being a second Chernobyl, and the other day, the explosion of a dam in the eastern Ukraine, which added new risks to this picture. There's much more to be said, but I think I will leave it to you.
Great, thank you very much, Mikkel. Well, yeah, there's not much to be said really, because we've covered a pretty daunting array of ground already. But one strand of discussion at the workshop, which is additional to what we've heard, in addition to the risks we face in the different areas, from financialization, around health, around existential threats, around security, is the threats posed by the idea of risk itself in the minds of those who use it, whatever they're looking at, like a hammer, the person with a hammer for whom every problem is a nail. And there's grounds for thinking, I mean, we live in a time when risk and science and democracy are counterpointed, as if they're in tension. We have all sorts of anxieties about, oh, can we respect science enough in a society which is trying to be democratic? Can we trust democracy? James Lovelock says we've got to put democracy on hold. Greta Thunberg says we've got no time for democracy. Do what the science says. So it's not just scientists saying this, or technocrats, or big corporations behind science. There's environmentalists, people on the streets. So that, for me, is a threat to democracy. We can talk about what is meant by democracy there, but risk thinking means whatever the area, you accept a bunch of parameters, you accept some boundaries, you accept a kind of expertise, you accept all kind of processes hidden away, which often, inadvertently, despite the best of intentions, will reflect the values and the interests of those who have greatest influence on the risk assessment. And then, whatever comes out of that box, that machine, is treated with the authority of sound science, of evidence-based policy, as if there's no choice now, you just implement the policy churned out of the machine. But the machine could have generated all kinds of different policies, but instead of us exploring the scope for choice of different policies we can take in all these areas, a risk mentality means that we're thinking of it in terms of a technical agenda. And on top of that, then, finally, just to open things up, I guess, a threat I see there for democracy is not just that erodes democracy in itself, it leaves less space for democracy, it undermines it, it discredits it, but also by adopting what is in fact an authoritarian, a scientific authoritarianism, not accounting for uncertainties, just saying do what the science says. What we're doing is not persuading people, we're provoking them. And back at us, like we see ourselves in the mirror, those of us part of this complex, which I count myself to be, see ourselves back, we see authoritarian populism coming back all around the world. And I think although it's complex, that's partly a reaction to these new institutions in finance, in environment, in health, that assert this risk language, and people know instinctively there's something wrong here, and we're provoking exactly the opposite reaction to what we intend. So less can be more, less risk discourse means more scope for democracy, and I think some of these problems might be easier to solve that way around.
Well, thanks to all of you for these kind of opening thoughts and questions. I guess, Andy, kind of following up from that, you've teed me up very nicely, because something I wanted to pose really to whomever wants to take it is precisely this kind of question of authority and legitimacy, right? We do sometimes talk about risk as a science, risk assessments as some sort of, just yes, following the science, just this is what the objective risk is versus this is what people's perceived risk is. And within those constructions is this notion that, right, that we have the tools and metrics, the data, and the expertise to talk about risk in that terms of kind of scientific objectivity to begin with. And it seems to me that these crises, Andy, that you gestured at in terms of a kind of rising trend of authoritarian populism, a kind of what I think of as like a faux populism that operates not as a critique of power, but as a critique of knowledge. It's perfectly fine with power. Actually, we'd like to have power more concentrated in certain hands. But that one of the manifestations of this is, of course, these kind of attacks on perceived elites, elite life, expertise, institutions, so on and so forth. We seem to have this kind of perfect storm, where on the one hand, we've gotten used to speaking of risk as a series of expert determinations that are conveyed via structures of entrenched authority, be they scientific, institutional, so on and so forth. And on the other hand, a kind of a population that is increasingly skeptical of precisely those institutions, those elites, those discourses about about science and so forth. So you have this kind of these, I would say these are, two very large kind of macro trends. And then in the middle of this, we of course do have real risks that we need to deal with and that we need to communicate with, and that some people are going to know more about than other people, right? Whether it is kind of threats of kind of nuclear proliferation or the next, pandemic. We talked today about different kind of, chemical risks, and I mean, the list goes on and on. So how do we even make any sort of intervention in this space, in either the way that, as people who are thinking about risk or researching, or even practitioners, can speak about risk that doesn't kind of reify these, I would say, very, very troublesome kind of dynamics. So I don't know, who would like to speak?
I mean, pluralize it. Don't accept anyone from any direction saying there's only one picture of the truth. It's a common set. When in a room, when you're looking at things in between us, we could argue endlessly about what's on the left, what's on the right. We just know, of course, it depends on your perspective. This isn't postmodern sort of abstraction. It's an everyday experience. When objects are looked at from different angles, those objects relate to each other differently. Likewise, when science looks at an object, science itself, never mind other perspectives, it will look different from different angles. It will look different to molecular biology, it will look different to soil science, it'll look different to social science of different kinds. It's perfectly okay for something to be true and plural. And yet when science meets the policy system, it is not allowed to say that. It's got to give, and I've experienced this the hard way in a number of places, just give one truth. Not because anyone really believes there is only one view, but because that's what the political system needs to justify its own privilege and power and pass blame on if something goes wrong. That's the dynamics of justification and blame. So that's why we're forced to represent science. And it's not just a point about policy, it's a point about science itself. And I say this as somebody who cares a lot about science. It's about being able to question authority in its roots, and yet is increasingly becoming a body of doctrine slapped down on the table as a form of authority. And that's, for me, the key to untangling this.
Perhaps, if I may just give a word for risk, not against it. I think if there's one thing which is challenging our democratic process and our democratic ideals, it is our fascination with dystopia, that the world is going to hell, and the only way we can influence it is whether it's fast and slow, but that's the way it's going. And there is zero democratic potential in that way of looking at the world. Either you just join the revolution, or you find a nice spot somewhere where you can do your barbecue with plenty of small arms and hope it will go away. But risk offers exactly, with the dangers you rightly pointed out, it also offers a way to say, okay, this is only 15%, but that one over there is 50. And at the moment you start talking about threats that way, where they are not the apocalypse, but something you can deal with, then there's also the possibility for politics and the possibility for democratic politics.
So I think one of the interesting things about the question you posed, Suzanne, is you've given us a choice between, on the one hand, it's the sort of technocracy, the expert determination, and on the other side, the complete negation of expertise and the skepticism of science. And those are both anti-democratic. I mean, so it's a sort of a lose-lose, there are both no way to sort of, with either of those models, have sort of collective deliberation over knowledge that would move us, towards the kind of world we'd like to live in ultimately. One of the things that I think is really encouraging is, I think, in the financial space that I tend to spend a lot of time thinking about, there are, on the one hand, this is a highly technical arena, and one of the concerns in this space is things are so, the problems are so technical, even the policymakers don't really understand what's going on. You need a, advanced degree, and so there is a sense that this is an arena that is not amenable to political control because it's too complex, too technical, too difficult. But on the counter to that, there are many instances of popular movements doing the work to get inside these technical systems, understand them, make decisions about how the banking systems could be organized, or how insurance. So, and we heard a great example of this in the workshop. Someone who presented work on a community effort to organize community-controlled insurance risk pool in Baltimore, right? And so this is the kind of thing where, against the notion that these systems are too technical, it is quite possible for community groups, social movements to learn the intricacies and master them and actually assert some kind of collective democratic decision-making that I think, suggests that these are, we aren't sort of stuck between technocracy on the one side and a complete rejection of expertise on the other. I think there are movements that have demonstrated that, there are those capacities to learn these systems and be able to turn them toward, purposes that are more amenable to collective ends.
And I would just even add to, on that even right, these are, of course, very extraordinary, complex and kind of systems, but even those trotting out the claims of complexity, we can see how this reifies existing kind of power relations and existing kind of technocratic and technocracy, and saying, oh, no, you members of the general public, you couldn't possibly understand. Right? These things are so difficult that you just have to leave them here in our kind of expert hands. And so it's kind of a fine line between, on the one hand, recognizing the extraordinary complexity of these things, and on the other hand, not taking the actors themselves for granted, not taking them at face value when they tell you that this is beyond public comprehension. And did you want to say something before?
So, yes, I'll add something to that. So I feel like an interesting example of that is the current debate about the dangers posed by artificial general intelligence. And so you have these companies like OpenAI and Google DeepMind, whose explicit goal is to develop, what are described as, extremely powerful technologies that, by definition, would be able to perform as well as humans in pretty much every cognitive domain of interest. I mean, the explicit goal of OpenAI is to create artificial systems that would be able to do every kind of economically valuable task there is. So in other words, to replace the vast majority of human workers. So all of that is to say, there's this vigorous debate now about the potential, existential threats posed by AGI, and the discussion about these risks is being promoted by these companies, who are also claiming that they are the only ones who have the solutions to these answers. So, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, recently testified in front of the Senate, and his plea was to regulate, the company. But if you sort of read between the lines, I mean, there's all sorts of things that they're doing that they don't want to regulate, and they're mostly concerned just about a kind of like global arms race between OpenAI and companies in China and so on. So the goal is then to maintain power within their company among the a very select small number of tech elites, because the claim, once again, is that they are the only ones who are properly positioned to solve these extremely complicated and very high stakes issues. And this kind of elitism, I think, can be found in the writings of some of the scholars who have been most interested in the threats of artificial general intelligence. That the decisions for how these technologies should be developed and ultimately regulated should be left up to them, not the demos, not the population.
So I kind of, one other kind of large issue I wanted to raise that many of our presentations touched on in one aspect or another, but kind of also picks up on the dystopian piece that, Mikhail, you were mentioning just before, is that I think in terms of I called this in the workshop, an affective paradox with regard to the present state of human security. Meaning that on one hand, we have this, there are certain matrices that will tell us that we're actually the safest that we've ever been. Right, that things have never been better, at least for maybe for those of us in this room, and that life is getting kind of safer according to all sorts of different data points that we could survey. Certainly, we spend just a tremendous amount of money on risk management. And in the workshop, I said that alongside the risk society, we have the risk management society. And we need to understand the rise of this industry really over the last, 30 to 40 years in particular, right? This didn't always exist. So I think it's helpful to kind of defamiliarize it and say, if I could really, it wasn't that risks and dangers didn't exist in, the 1940s, the 1950s, something like this, but yet I could not go to a degree program and study risk as an applied discipline. I could not write, journal articles for these, dedicated journals about risk and risk management outside of maybe the realm of insurance. So something kind of fundamental has happened here in orientation that encourages us to think about our political and social lives through the realm of risk, or through that kind of the rubric of risk, and to use the assumptions and frameworks that have been handed down to us largely from commercial spaces to kind of navigate these challenges of social and political life. So I think this is, again, kind of a long-winded way of saying, I think we have the moment of paradox that we have to explain, which is, given the unprecedented amount of money that is spent on risk management, risk assessment by a variety of kind of public sector and private bodies, academics, so on down the line, given these kind of statistics that show a certain increased safety, right, in people's everyday lives, why is the experience of our contemporary moment the dystopian one? Why is it that it's this sense of anxiety and precarity that seems to be so pervasive? Because we seem to have a mismatch between our, and I'm wondering if there's something going on here with the kind of pursuit of absolute security and the amount of kind of control over the future that project entails on the one hand, and our capacity to really deliver. So if anyone wants to speak to this, yeah, please.
I'll make a start. I'm not so much sure on the anxiety, but I think I'd just like to make the point that the growth in risk management in many cases is highly desirable and based on some very good reasons. And for instance, if you go back in the oil industry to the 1980s and the Piper Alpha disaster, this changed the sort of face of safety and how they thought about it in the oil industry. And it started to be studied scientifically, to be treated as an organizational problem. Before, I suppose very crudely, it was perhaps, certainly in healthcare, much more, you had to be careful. If there was an accident, it wasn't because the equipment was poorly designed, it was because you were an idiot. And all of these industries, aviation, nuclear, and finally healthcare, have started to take the view risk management is not just a matter of individual responsibility, it's an organizational responsibility. It needs thought, it needs risk analysis, and all this sort of thing. But it can, as Andy was pointing out, it can be misused, and certainly in healthcare, it can shade into not trying to make things as safe as possible, but a rather crude version of absolute safety where you try and tie everything down with endless standards and regulation and bureaucracy. Or you can sort of distort the basic idea of it and produce some undesirable effects. And rather than, I think it was he said before, rather than striving, to my mind, for sort of absolute safety, it's much more a question of trying to be very explicit about the benefits and risks and do whatever you can to mitigate them, but not get into the state of pretending that there's any absolute security, whether as a patient or a system. So, but we shouldn't sort of feel that the risk management direction is all bad, at least not in all industries.
Other explanation might also be that very discourse about the world getting safer and safer and richer isn't really true, and perhaps never have been. I mean, if you look at my research area, conflict, warfare, it might be true that Western Europe was a pretty peaceful place, apart from the nuclear weapons and stuff, from 1945 to the end of the Cold War. But look at Asia, look at Africa, that's not their experience at all. And so I'm just wondering whether what has actually happened is that we have increasingly insisted on modern Western society being peaceful, being a place where people are growing older and richer and so on. And then we got suddenly surprised when that is not necessarily the case. And perhaps there is a gulf between the promise inherent in that story and what is actually happening. And risk is a way to navigate that space in between.
So I'm going to be agnostic about whether safety is increasing or risk is increasing, because I think, in either case, I think we can explain why there's a broad perception that there's an exposure to risk that feels different, and that's because of the social structure by which risk is managed. And I think one certain trend. We did have institutions that collectivized risk, mid-20th century welfare states, and we've seen a broad deterioration in those systems, and increasingly, an institutional logic that says to individuals, you bear the cost of your risk. If you're engaging in these activities and these behaviors, that's your responsibility. You should, bear the cost of those of activities and behaviors, and that that model of the individualization of risk, we know it from insurance primarily, but of course it's moved out. That kind of actuarial thinking has moved from insurance into other domains, medicine, criminal justice, education. We have these sort of models where basically the idea is you make these choices, take these behaviors, and the outcome is your responsibility. So I think broadly, there's a pretty good sociological explanation for why there's a perception of increased risk, even if at some absolute level, we're a little uncertain as to whether we actually are more exposed to danger and hazard now than as opposed to some point in the past.
And I think in addition, following on from those things. Thanks for questioning the veracity of these claims about how the world is. It depends on where you stand, and what like knowledge always is. But I think we have to, and it doesn't need to any single necessary conclusion, but we need to think about, as we would in our everyday lives, about how power works of different kinds, how privilege works, how patronage works. Our lives are complex, actually. It's not only these things that are complex, our lives are complex, and we're always thinking, looking behind the scenes, why, he would have said that, wouldn't he, is a term people use all the time in their everyday lives. And so why would we be being told this? That somehow it's all about safety, it's all about risk, costs and benefits, when in fact values and interests and power and hopes for the future are the stock in trade of politics that's getting put out. So of course we're being told that it's all about values and interests, by benefits and costs and risks and safety, by interests for whom discussion about interests and power is very inconvenient. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to be able to explain why that happens. And of course, questioning expertise is then interpreted as throwing it out entirely. Of course, I put the point earlier that seems to be, expertise is absolutely essential, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And why is it that there's this hysterical reaction back so often, oh, you're saying we don't need expertise, and in the way, Greta, you rightly characterized it, that polarized thing. It's not about throwing expertise out, it's about recognizing it's necessary but not sufficient. It always contains values. Likewise, of course, risk management is extremely potent with machines and can save lives on a great scale, like in the airline industry. But society and environments and the earth and history are not machines. So, we then need to challenge this thing expanding out from the domain where it is undoubtedly successful without getting this reaction, well, somehow you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I think how power works, and we'll come to different conclusions, but we'll have a more healthy debate about why these kinds of claims are made. And in the end, there's behind it this theme of indebtedness. Somehow we should all be grateful to this complex that's given us this supposed benefits. And that storyline, you should be in debt to me, we should be very wary of that. It's a very familiar thing in everyday life as well, that you're told you're indebted, therefore stop making a fuss.
Also, just wanted to point out that it could be true simultaneously that the world is getting safer, less risky, but also more risky. If you accept the narrative that I think you were alluding to, championed most notably by people like Steven Pinker, that the probability of any single individual perishing as a result of a homicide or being the victim of assault or something of the sort, today is much lower than pretty much any time in human history, going back even into the Pleistocene to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. But at the same time, it seems like the risk of global catastrophes has increased simultaneously. So we're in the middle of the long peace right now. So-called long peace. There hasn't been a major direct conflict between major powers in the world since World War II. But at the same time, we've been living under what JFK referred to in 1962 as the, or is it 61? Well, early 60s, as the nuclear sword of Damocles. So it's just this sword is just hanging over us, suspended by a single horse's hair, and at any point tomorrow there could be a nuclear conflict that catapults us into the eternal grave. So and obviously there's climate change, which is just going to get much worse throughout the century. The possibility of global pandemics might be the probability might actually be increasing. So on the one hand, you have the potential for individuals or small groups to use synthetic biology techniques to synthesize a designer pathogen. So this could be much more contagious, much more lethal, and fatal, incurable, and so on than any virus that natural selection could possibly produce. Furthermore, it can travel from continent to continent at the speed of a jetliner. So, considerations like these suggest that, sort of gesturing back at my opening statement, that we may be in a sort of uniquely unprecedented moment of extreme risk. But these risks tend to be sort of global in nature. And so that is compatible with, at the same time, your likelihood of dying in homicide and so on declining.
No, thank you, Emil. And I think it kind of, it hits on something that we discussed kind of, I would say, at length, and that is highly relevant to the kind of question of democracy, particularly democracy vis-a-vis some sort of collective action, right? We need to think about democracy not just as stuffing your vote in the ballot box, but kind of expanding the realms where democratic participation and collective action matter. Because these instances where people feel powerless, whether it's in their kind of, their financial life, am I going to have money to retire, right? Is it facing a kind of a pandemic that, is again, can potentially be infectious to, right, to everybody, even if they have kind of varying health outcomes depending on, other disparities, so on and so forth. Whether we're talking about kind of climate war, these are the feature of these risks in a kind of risk society, as Beck identified them, is that they're by definition beyond the local, right? So it's not limited to the production of risk by, a single agent, and then the risk itself is kind of born in the same spot. These sorts of risks are not, they don't recognize national boundaries. They're not limited in scope. And it's, and Beck has this interesting, comparison in the book where he talks about how, right, if I'm setting sail across the ocean, in the 17th century, I have a number of risks that I face, right? My ship could go down, I could drown, the sailors aboard the ship, we could lose all the cargo, right? There's any number of risks that are inherent in that, but they're also localized to the ship, the people on it, those goods, right, those investors, et cetera. And that the feature of kind of risk in modernity is the kind of inability to kind of control those to some sort of local, right? That they are systemic, they are kind of interconnected, they exceed any sort of, the experience of risk and the effects of risk exceeds the sites of production of risk. Right, and as we see kind of with climate across the board. And all of this for me points to the strange individualistic logic that we get, on the other hand, to manage risk. So if this is our context, where so much of this seems to be at the level of systems, at the level of if not the global, then certainly the hypernational and kind of beyond and regional, then the tools then that we are given as individuals seem to be hyper-focused on what are you doing in your individual life, right? Are you eating enough salads? Did you go running today? Right? Did you install your security system? Did you monitor your 401k? Right? There's all of these kind of behaviors of, that I've kind of grouped under this heading of the actuarial self that we offer people. Just as those collective frameworks for dealing with and mitigating risk have kind of dissolved or deteriorated. But yes, so this kind of mismatch, I think, is really fundamental to understanding our kind of like contemporary articulations of the risk society. And so what I want to ask you all about is probably our final question before we open it up to the audience is, what then does successful collective action look like, right? Vis-a-vis, the kind of systemic risks that we face. How can we move beyond a just like purely individualized logic of risk assessment to think about these things at a broader level that will be, more compatible, at least, with forms of democratic deliberation, decision-making, and public life?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and I need, lots more time to think about it. But just one brief response. I think, at some level, I want to, in spite of my earlier remark about and my research about the individualization of risk, I think I want to push against a little bit the individual collective, in the sense that, okay, so let's take the, climate stuff. Okay, so we all know that, we can't solve this as individuals, et cetera. And when I put solar panels on my roof, okay, I'm making myself feel better, but, what's this going to add to? Or when I, get the electric car and if it's sitting in my driveway, et cetera. There's another way of, there is another way of thinking of it. So, these individual level solutions are not likely to scale up, except, I'm a sociologist, so I think about network effects. And there's a signaling, right? So people in my neighborhood see the solar panels and they think, and people see the electric car. And so I think there is a way that when we take individual, it seems like I'm just, doing an individual action that's not going to amount to much, but, we can think about these as moving through a collective and people, So I think we draw the line between individual action and collective outcomes a little too sharply when we've, I think it's important to remember that, partly we are signaling, we're part of communities, we're part of networks, and, sometimes our individual actions do, I'm not suggesting this is in any way adequate as a solution to climate change. This is a small illustration of something that seems purely individual, but surely, I have solar panels because I saw it on my neighbor's roof, and I'm like, oh, that's a good idea, Do you have
like a neighborhood association, though, that encourages people to get solar panels and gives you the resources and the links to the tax filings?
We are moving in that direction, yes, yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, how do we get out of this pickle?
Andy, move the microphone.
How do we get out of this pickle? I don't know. I mean, one of the things is the blindsiding of uncertainty, that in this sort of situation, especially academics like me are inveigled into, over-exaggerating how much we might know. But something to throw into the mix is that just get beyond this control idea. When we look out at other societies, it's quite easy to see the major storylines that those societies will come up with for all kinds of different situations. What is ours? It's difficult to see when you're inside it, but I think it's control. Modernity is obsessed with control. Everything it looks at, it thinks about it in terms of control. It can't imagine agency, people being able to act, without it being controlling. So we have to work hard to think of other kinds of agency, other ways to act in the world to make it better, in the case here. And that opens up democracy by just opening up different ways of thinking about action. And I think one that comes to the fore, a huge debt to feminism in this, but also Catholic tradition have thought about it, is care. Just as a thought experiment, when you're tempted to think about something as control, think about it instead as care. Affording agency, being more humble, being more open, accepting a greater plurality. So already risk goes out of the board. You could do that in risk with sensitivity analysis and some of the things we've heard, but the culture doesn't let you. But if we do that, then what does collective action look like? I think it looks like, rather than a machine, it looks like the flocking behavior of birds or fish. And when the time is right, they will change direction incredibly quickly. It's horizontal communication, it's mutualistic, it's cooperative, it's not hierarchical and stratified like a risk paradigm. And so there's no reason why you can't address serious, urgent challenges in that mode too. In fact, you could argue it's the only way. It's the only way progressive change, maybe, has occurred in society, like women's emancipation and end of slavery and decolonization, were that kind of flocking behavior of culture. So maybe that's what we should look to, and the way expertise can help that is by just not closing it down and asserting a singular, uncertainty-free view, but opening it up and saying, maybe this, under those conditions, maybe that. Provoking and catalyzing that flocking behavior, I think, is the way to get beyond.
Well, so I think we are going to, we have about a half hour left. I want to open it up for questions from anyone in the audience here. There is a microphone that Clara is going to bring around. So just if you can just be patient with your question until the microphone arrives so that we can all hear you, that would be great. So I think we have one right up here. Thank you, Clara. Yes. No, hold on, Michael. Sorry.
Yes, hello, thank you, very thought-provoking indeed. And
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I made the same problem you have. There's a Roman poet, Tibullus, who said that the first thing God made in the world was fear. And it's clear that fear is a very fundamental human emotion, maybe more basic than anything else. And that has been used time and time again to manipulate people by the Catholic Church, for example, fear of what happens if you don't follow the tenets of the religion, etc. And I think that lesson was learned by power mongers and people in business quite effectively. And so it's used ever more frequently now as a tool for manipulating decisions. I think almost everyone now tries to use that. The future is uncertain, so yes, there's always an element of an uncertain outcome, and so you convert that into a kind of negative outcome, and therefore fear enters into the picture. So I wonder how much of what we think of as more complexity and risk is really just more complexity in the way we're being manipulated by people that want to use fear to get the outcomes they desire.
Go.
Please go.
So, interesting point. I think you're totally right that obviously fear has been, a mechanism, a lever that, individuals in power or institutions of power have used to manipulate individuals. But also, I don't know, it's maybe just worth noting the long history of people who genuinely cared about, the example that comes to mind is the avoidance of nuclear catastrophe. So fear has been utilized by activists and intellectuals who were trying to mitigate this threat. to some degree of success. You know, the founding of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1945 by a bunch of Manhattan Project scientists who were worried about the device that they had invented. The explicit aim, in Eugene Rabinowicz's, who co-founded the Bulletin, in his words, was to frighten men into rationality. And so obviously then you see the same sort of theme all the way up into the contemporary climate movement. Greta Thunberg obviously has said, I want you to panic. I don't want you to be calm. I want you to fear. So yeah, I don't know. It's in terms. This is something I think about a lot. When writing about the threat of global catastrophe, what is the best strategy for conveying the threat? But and there are really two schools of thought. One is to use fear as a motivator, and the other is like fear is actually it's going to be paralyzing, and you should avoid it at all costs. So I don't know. I guess I'm just adding a comment to say that this is an issue that I think a lot about, but don't really have a good answer, and I'm still trying to navigate.
If I may add, then what the risk perspective at least offers to that age-old way of getting people to do something they would rather not, is perhaps a view on this as a process, not an instance where you are afraid for something and then you do X, Y, Z, but a continuous debate with a certain subject on how to proceed on this. I mean, again, warfare is a good example. That is not a threat which is done away with once and for all. It's a constant thing where you have to negotiate the prospect of war and what you can do to avoid it. And I think the risk perspective offers a way not only to look at how to deal with that fear or that risk, but also a way to evaluate the things you do in order to overcome it. It might be that some of the stuff you do to avoid global warming might be even as dangerous as global warming in itself. And I think risk reflects and offers methods to deal with complicated situations where one action might actually lead to new problems, new risks.
Yeah, so you just additional, I really agree with what's been said. You put very well dangers of fear, and I think the antidote, to be brief about it, the antidote to fear is hope. And actually one can make a case, again contestable, that hope is at least as prominent in society and in nature, in life generally, as fear. So, but the point isn't to eradicate one, and just like the purpose isn't to throw out risk assessment entirely or risk thinking and replace it with something else, replace it with flourishing, or throw out control and replace it with care. It's about just appreciating the plurality of these things. They have relations that matter, and let's balance those relations. And the danger of risk is not so much the risk itself, because you put well there, and the benefits in its own setting. It's metastasized beyond its domain. We're getting swallowed up in it. So it's about restoring a balance of hope with fear, of flourishing with risk, and of care with control, I think, and many others as well.
Yeah. Michael, please.
I didn't go to the workshop, but I've been interested but frustrated in the panel because...
Would you tell us how you really feel?
Sorry? No, it seems to me that it's been very general and hasn't got a sense of the real world. And if I could just make one or two remarks about that. I was asked many years ago by the policy planning staff of our Foreign Office to advise them on democratization. And so I did that and spent a lot of my time afterwards on it. But one of my methods was to go to Washington. And I was at the Wilson Center, I was at the British Embassy, I did various things, and certain things happened and occurred to me. The first was that somebody else at lunch at the Wilson Center was General Gazit, who'd taken over the military intelligence of Israel, and just after the failure of Israel to appreciate the risk of being invaded in October 1973. So the question in this quite limited thing was, how could a highly qualified intelligence agency get it so wrong? So that was the first one. The second was actually in a snowstorm, meeting a friend of mine from Oxford who was a senior official, and he said, he was the head of all British foreign policy, to say, I'm awake at night because there are 20 things that could be risks, and I wonder about the 21st that I haven't even thought of. And so the question of complexity and unexpected things came in there. I then had another couple of lunches, and this won't go on forever. One of them was with a dying, very senior CIA deputy director, actually. And the question that he had was that there'd been such pressure within the CIA to give numbers and probabilities for everything. Where was the greatest risk? Where was the second? And that being a good intelligence agent was sort of often giving numbers to things and quantifying risk. And this, of course, is absurd, but there was very strong professional pressure on that. And then I had my final lunch was with somebody else who'd been involved in CIA, they call them evaluations or things. And this woman, I said, well, in democracy, there's no point in predicting which African country is going to have a revolution. You don't need to. You can spread your risk. And she said, no. In order to get our money in Congress, we need to give definite predictions. And so there is this speed. The final thing was a relative of mine who was working at quite a high level in government, and he said, I have 170 pieces of information coming in to advise the minister every night. And it may well be at 11 in the night that the strategic one is intentionally pushed among the other 169. And so I think that in a way, we're in an extremely complicated and unknown situation. And the task of risk experts is to marry up the theories and the experiences with actual situations in which they might be applied. And these may be far less rational and far faster than one might imagine.
I mean, I'm happy to speak to this as the as a convener of all of these things. Well, you're right. This is, we are trying to have a conversation that is opposed, that in some ways goes against the grain of the way that most risk conversations do happen, which are in a very siloed and technocratic fashion. I don't think there's any shortage of people who are thinking about risk in precisely the kind of real world applied, extremely technocratic terms that you're asking for. But what I've asked people to do is step back a little bit from that and to say, what are this bundle of assumptions, these frameworks, how do they operate, how do these things kind of connect, right? And the solutions to these things in the healthcare space do not look like they look like in the security space or in the climate space, right, or in the financial space. And I think it would be ridiculous to expect that we could offer some sort of concrete solutions to, to even one of those things. So what I'm trying to do instead is to offer us a framework to kind of complicate even the approach of our world through this lens of risk. Try to understand whose perspectives are being centered in these sorts of risk assessments, how they're entwined with kind of these workings of power, how they're frankly entwined with these, broader workings of history. So yes, obviously our workshop did get a lot more into specifics, but in the course of this event, we're trying to I would say kind of speak more at the bird's eye view than that kind of siloed and technocratic one. But a few things I'll mention that came out of the workshop that speak to your latter points was, right, I mean, we hear this repeatedly. We have this, this great book, When Genius Failed, right, that we have these continual instances in which the smartest people of every generation seem to get it wrong, right, that they miss the great thing that's kind of coming down the pipeline. Why does this kind of continue to happen? And something that we've kind of, where we've kind of, say, zeroed in on two things. One is the kind of allure of quantification. And we are living through this kind of new period of quant fever right now, where we think that because we have this hyperabundance of data, particularly with like an online age, that thus that data tells us something meaningful and can be used in this predictive way. But telling the future is always really a very, very, very troublesome and uncertain operation, no matter how much kind of data we have to behind it, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, which is that the unprecedented could happen. Things change dramatically, right? We don't have reasonable expectation to say that the 21st century is going to look like the 20th. And many of our probabilistic calculations are based on past frequencies. What has happened in the past? So a huge issue here with our kind of risk assessment is, to what extent are those past occurrences even a guide for what we can expect to experience going forward? And that I think that, at least for me, and I think for many people, this hammered home the real importance of some sort of humility, and that risk and this kind of attempt to kind of control the future in this way can be an expression of hubris, in addition as a concern for safety and a real concern for human security. So to really understand the limits of what we can do, and I'll add kind of to that maybe we don't need more maybe we don't need to eliminate uncertainty. Maybe we actually need more care, so that when that uncertainty comes around, we have some sort of mechanism that we're not kind of the single atom falling through space on our own.
I think it's a central challenge, and a lot of people will make it, so thank you for raising it. But I want to push back a little bit harder, because you expressed frustration. And in addition to what's just been said, we have actually talked about practical things that can be done. For instance, don't report your risk judgments as one conclusion, do a number. So when one has demanded of one an answer to a risk problem, don't give one answer. Tell them how the answer depends on the question and the way it's posed and your assumptions. Make that transparent, be honest about it. That can be done in every single type of analysis just as quickly. In fact, sometimes it takes a long time to wrap it all up with the one-handed economists that ministers like. But I have to say that it characterizes the problem we're talking about very well, that the real world is so often, when as it has been with your challenge, the world of, at each of your examples, were high-level people in high-level organizations. You were very keen to say that. And who said that's the real world? I'm interested in the real world, outside the real world, which I'm often challenged by, where that real world of politics and business and big NGOs, that wants to treat things as simple, to manipulate in the ways we're resisting. The real world is on the receiving end of that. So, I come back in the same spirit, really. I think there's, in a way, it's indicated quite well the jugular vein of this discussion, this exchange.
There's a question right behind Manal. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Very interesting. I think one thing that I don't think I heard today is how in managing risk and planning for risk, there is a bias both at an individual level and a collective level to think that, oh, the world will be okay. I mean, we do that generally when we have a deadline. We're like, oh, it'll probably take me, a day to finish this, but it takes us like 4. And I think there's, the same thing when we manage certain things, especially global risks, and that tends to or produces a second problem, I think, that we often in managing or balancing the different risks that arise of a given situation, there's a tendency to focus on the short term, not the long term, thinking, well, the long term will just be okay. We'll manage that when we get there. And I just want to give 2 examples of this. The first one is, the climate problems and energy transition. So, Europe has been kind of preaching to the world that, what they should do with decarbonization and climate policies and stop using fossil fuels. And then, the moment they're hit with a potential energy security problem, that risk all of a sudden trumps everything else. But also all the plans to reach net zero in 2050 or whatever, including by the European Union, are all completely kind of forgotten. So globally, we still talk about them, we still talk how important that is, but we're not doing anything to meet that target. And all the focus is really on how do we make sure now we're gonna have enough gas, and let's go and have an agreement with Qatar for 30 years to get gas or whatever. And that is a real risk that is very, very important. And it's maybe we just think, the next generation will fix it, or maybe, we'll just fix it, but we're not even putting the investments to fix it in the future. And the second problem, or second example, I think, is, which I think is really massive and maybe gives us a lot of lessons to kind of really explore collectively, is the COVID pandemic. So when that happened, everyone, and I think the risk of the way that this was handled is, oh my God, we might all die, this big problem. So everything else stopped being a risk. And here in the UK, for example, a lot of places for screening cancer were closed. So cancer is no longer a problem. We forget that cancer could be a risk, but all of a sudden, or that isolation and people not talking to each other is a risk. But then the big risk is this, and forcing people to take a new vaccine sometimes with a new technology that now people are realizing might have problems. So how do you, and then of course that has effects on democracy and all, the risk just goes on and on and on. So I wonder what your thoughts on kind of, how do you manage these risks? Because we don't have systems to kind of balance these long versus short and the human bias in this. I'm sorry, that was a very long question.
I just want to say one quick thing, and then I'll open it up to everybody else too, is that I think you've hit on something really important, which is that risks are contested. Right? Risk designations reflect certain positions, they reflect certain concerns, which means they almost necessarily come into conflict with other people's risk assessments or other sets of concerns. Which is why when we're talking about risk, it's very useful to say a risk to whom, or to what, or to, from which position. And that too often the kind of leaning back on a very kind of sterilized, quantified, technocratic language obscures the fact that risk determinations are actually contested and wrapped up with power. Other thoughts?
Perhaps just add to what you were saying, that policymakers, of course, know this. And that trade-off between which risk you choose to act on and the ones you basically cause happening to you by doing that. COVID lockdown is a far too good example for this. Is very much part of modern policymaking, and I'm not offering a quick fix to that, other than suggesting that what you're saying is exactly right, and that would be the everyday life of many people in government or large organizations as such, to juggle those different kinds of risks.
Yeah, the COVID example is interesting. I'm no expert in this, but I think it was clear to people in healthcare fairly early on that there was a huge downsides in healthcare. I'm not really making a point about the lockdown. There was probably good reason at the early stages to worry, that who knew what was going to happen with this. But very, very difficult to come out and really acknowledge what's a trade-off. Mm-hmm. And to say, well, if we do this, so-and-so, these people will die, and if we don't do this, these other people will die. And I think the quest, as you were saying, for sort of certainty in numbers and be absolutely right, which we've all been talking about, is very, very strong. I mean, just as a sort of human thing. And if you're an organization or a politician or whatever, the public communications is always, safety is our top priority, or, we're going to do this. And it's very difficult to be more nuanced, and yet this is probably what's required to make intelligent risk decisions, is to level with people a bit more and say, actually, there are pros and cons about this. So this is much more explicit, I think, as Andy was saying earlier, acknowledgement of uncertainty and the pros and cons of different actions, and laying it out a bit more as a preparation. I would certainly like to see more of that in many, many spheres, actually.
And on the long term, I think it's a great point, and Emil talked fantastically about what, the long term doesn't speak with one voice. It doesn't have any necessary consequence to think long-term. The sustainability lobby, which I'm part of, thinks it's got a handle on that, and then Emil talked today, you may want to say something about it, about a completely different vision of what happens when the long-term gets brought in. So one problem we know really well is that democracy in the sense of limited term of office, first past the post, parliamentary process, that has a problem with looking long-term for sure. But democracy in the way I'm talking about it is, access by the least powerful to the capacities for challenging power. It's a broader thing. It includes all kinds of institutions and practices in society, allowing people to challenge power. And that way, I think we can look after the long term as well as, it's in the end, it's the only arena within which the long term can be settled. Because anyone who claims to speak for the long term with one voice, you can be very suspicious has got a very short-term interest in mind.
We have lots of questions. So maybe in the interest of time, maybe we'll collect a few of them and then and let the kind of panelists speak, just because we are almost running out of short.
I will make it quick. I keep thinking about the moral duty of artists, seeing as most of the education of the next generation is coming from what they watch on Netflix. In speaking of the Manhattan Project, I'm an ethicist. I've crossed my fingers that Christopher Nolan knows more about ethics than me, because the nuclear story is about to be told on July 22nd. And I was like, I've like prayed to a God I didn't think I believed in. I was like, what could Christopher Nolan be? Who taught him when he was young?
Thank you. Well, let's collect a few questions and then we'll.
So about the science versus democracy, like the COVID lockdowns are obviously a very good example of that. And maybe there are some things that are more like positive questions, like young people's, like whether they'll die compared to old people, and then something more scientific. And then other things are more like normative and philosophical, like freedom versus health of the elderly. So that's more like up to democracy. And is that like a fair caricature? And then is it a fair caricature to say that the left was more like, trust the scientists, and the right was more like, don't trust the scientists, it's up to you? Is that a fair caricature? And were there any like think tanks or political parties or powerful individuals who are doing a good job at differentiating the two?
I think I like what you mentioned about the systemic nature of risks. As I was sitting here listening to the panel, so nobody's brought up the idea of polycrisis or wicked problem or super wicked problems, which is kind of central to any consideration of risk in 21st century. And talking about the real world, when you're faced with those complex and very distributed problems, that the policy response is to tame it, to narrow it down, to make it small. And that's why, with all the risks that entails, and that's why I was so happy to hear about the pluralization of expertise as an antidote to the narrowing down of risk, of framing and conception of risk. But on the other hand, the pluralization of expertise is problematic as well, in that it can create ignorance in the same way that the narrowing down of expertise can create ignorance. So the question of COVID-19 is a nice example where a narrow conception of risk leads to ignorance about other considerations. But equally, the pluralization of expertise can lead to ignorance when knowledge is contested and makes it more difficult to locate the expertise, to locate knowledge, leaving it open to misinformation, fake news, and all the rest. So I'd like to hear your views on the creation of ignorance by pluralizing expertise, as well as the risks of not pluralizing expertise, if that makes sense.
Thank you to all the panelists. I'll try to make this coherent. My question is around tribalism. I'm going to look at it firstly from the point of view of nuclear safety. Like us as a species, this is one of our greatest existential risks, at least in my opinion. At the same time, even though we as humans have this risk, the prevailing policy in nuclear safety is mutually assured destruction. We don't get rid of our nuclear weapons because the others also have the nuclear weapons, right? And another global risk, pandemic, which intelligence knew that it was going to happen. That is why we were able to produce vaccines so quickly. Pandemic happened, and we were all in this together. But as it was continuing to happen, we saw this stratification of how the moderator said at the very beginning that risks can be both universal and unevenly experienced. And if artificial intelligence became a threat to us, I'm sure we would be very united in fighting that threat. And I'm like waiting for some nuclear catastrophe to happen that is not big enough to eradicate us. Like pandemic did not eradicate us. It was like, actually, if you look at the World Health Organization data, only 1% was even infected. 1% of all humans on Earth. So if a nuclear event happens, and it spreads through the social media, we will have all the political will we need to get rid of the nukes. But at some point, it will become, well, those who were directly affected, like Hibakusha, those who do not know, Hibakusha are the people who were directly affected by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of them are still alive, and they are the outcasts of their culture. So, given that tribalism is something that is like deeply ingrained in our animal brain, and people have different needs, like we're not all the same, and everyone has like limited capacity of what they can do to consider others in our day-to-day life. Can you reflect on what we can do to overcome this problem? Thank you.
Thank you, Clara.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel today. I'm interested in hearing how we should conceptualize the human well-being over time and across generations in respect to climate change, income inequality, homeownership, stagnating incomes, student debt. We see that the gray generation has extracted so much and is now investing very little in the future generations. All the while, we're collectively damaging the climate and not like taking the actions that are necessary. So I would like to hear your thoughts on how you expect that to play out going forward, and in particular in the Western democracies.
Thanks. Very similar comment, but maybe about the intergenerational issue. How is that factored into essentially who gets the power to make the decision? It seems absent from the conversation. But I also had a question of more practical nature. How do we start discussing balancing risks with people? So I work in child health, and the fear is that you need to drive your child to school because they'll get knocked, if they walk, they'll get knocked over or kidnapped or something terrible. So that's an immediate risk, whereas the long-term risk is we have masses of childhood obesity, so they will pay for it later for not being allowed to walk to school. How do we have those very practical discussions that allow people to balance risks?
I think maybe in the interest of time, what we'll do is we'll just go down the row and let everybody have a chance to respond to whatever collection of these topics you'd like. So yeah, Charles.
I've got very little to say on the kind of global threats that are raised, and I'll leave that to the existential end of the panel. But I think what you say about the explicit discussion of risks, I think I'd like to see a lot more, I don't know how to say this, but sort of discussions with citizens conducted in various ways to kind of explore and balance these risks. Sorry. Because I think most of these situations, there's often a sort of quick fix, short-term solution, whatever kind of risk you're dealing with. And in fact, you're going to have risks and benefits playing out on different timescales. And until you've got some way of putting these all on the tables, you're very difficult to make any kind of sensible decisions. And whether that's in, I guess, in politics or, you know, it worries me, for instance, that we're moving more and more to everything dependent on the electricity supply. And there is no redundancy in the system, so that the payment system goes down, the hospital electronics records will go down. Nobody thinks about backup systems. And these sort of scenario planning situations, which we heard from, in terms of war, and I can think of in various times, would be invaluable, I think, in all sorts of situations. And the other thing is, somebody was asking earlier about the attitudes to risk. In a way, somebody once said, is the price of safety is chronic unease. And that's a bit strong in all scenarios, but it does require a willingness to always be thinking, yeah, but this might go wrong. And in what ways might it go wrong? And I don't see nearly enough of that kind of thinking. And it's not a matter of gloom and no innovation, but it is a matter of backup plans, sort of plan B, and thinking, yes, but what if, in all sorts of situations. Sorry, it's a bit of a longer answer than I meant.
So I'll just take two of these questions really, hopefully concisely. So the question about the creation of ignorance is a great question. And I just want to reference back to a discussion we had at the workshop where one of our panelists presented a paper in which he was talking about the way that these sort of, these plans where you're supposed to, make your own decision about, what healthcare program or what pension or what, loan payback, you're having to navigate all these decisions about how to handle these risks, has stratifying effects for obvious reasons. People are differently positioned in terms of how well they can respond to the various incentives and how well they understand them and so forth. But in addition, he made a point that I think is really relevant to your comment, which is there's actually a great interest that vendors of these various services have in manipulating information. There's a kind of predatory aspect to drawing people into these plans. And so I think it's important to remember that, you were talking about, kind of the narrowing of risk and the globalization of expertise as both creating ignorance. There's also, we can speak, even more cynically about, an industry of individuals who are essentially manipulating information in order to essentially profit from people who are, falling into, various of these plans. So it's both of the things you pointed to, and in addition, their information is asymmetric and it's manipulated, and I think that's, there's some distortion here. So that was a conversation we had in the workshop. The second question about, a later question about human well-being, also a really interesting point in the context of stagnating incomes, crushing debts, and all of the other ills we've been talking about. How do we understand human well-being? I think, one thing this brings to mind for me is, the late anthropologist David Graeber's work on debt and his kind of moral framework for rethinking what debt means in society, what we owe each other, and so forth. And his framework for this was debt forgiveness. So in other words, we have a very moralizing understanding of debt. We think, okay, if you're in debt, it's your fault, you've done all these things, you weren't prudent, et cetera. Once you have a more structural and systemic sociological understanding of, well, we have a system that actually requires debt, and so essentially we can collectivize those obligations as well, and so this was a David Graeber has a pretty good moral framework for thinking about this. And it seems utopian and fantastic, but in fact, in the U.S., it's gained a lot of ground, and there's significant move for debt forgiveness in student loans, and some of that has actually been actualized. And it's hitting some snags in the court system, but I think this is a feasible idea that has some political legs. So that's one take on human well-being in the context of crushing debt, stagnating incomes, and all the rest. So.
So I'll keep this very short. So I don't think I have any particular insights on any of the questions that were asked, all of which were really quite good. Maybe just underline that I agree that future generations ought to be taken into consideration in our sort of deliberations about the potential repercussions of current day actions on that sort of ripple into the coming decades and maybe centuries. So intergenerational justice, I think, needs to be a key component to evaluating risk, particularly large-scale risk.
Well, I have been looking forward to answering the Christopher Nolan question. I'm a huge fan, and I'm looking very much forward to the movie, I have to say. And I hope that I'm not the only one who goes and sees it. I would love a few AI researchers to go as well. Because what we also have been talking about is the role of technology and how technology can develop in new ways, some of them extremely dangerous, and in societies which are increasingly complex, which are increasingly dependent on expert systems, then these developments are not getting less dangerous. And if you read some of the accounts of what actually happened at the Manhattan Project, it is very difficult to understand how the people who were doing that research didn't really stop and wonder what that was actually going to end up being. And many of them actually didn't. And I would very much hope that new generations of scientists would actually do so.
Yeah, great questions. The left and right point, I think, is really well said. It's a tragedy for anyone with progressive values that the left has basically fallen more foul of technocratic thinking than the right. It didn't have to happen that way, but that's a tragedy, and the left needs to find its democratic mojo again, I'd say. The point about who makes the decisions, what about the grey generation? I think, in a way, that's why we're talking about democracy tonight. I'm a representative of all kinds of different intersectional privileges myself, and the way to challenge the undue emphasis from those is accessed by the least powerful to the capacities for challenging power and privilege of those kinds. So yes, grey generation, race, gender, sexuality, democracy is the way that we look at things from these different perspectives. That's why we're talking about this, I think. On the wicked problems and ignorance, great question. I mean, you're sitting next to Jerry Ravitz, and Jerry Ravitz associated here with the James Martin Institute, absolutely pioneered a lot of the stuff, much better actually than I've said it tonight. And thinking about these kinds of methods, I say an insight that comes to me from that is, don't think of knowledge and ignorance as volumes. They're things that we make. They're constructed. Both of them are constructed. And they're not just inverse. As Einstein pointed out, the circle of knowledge gets bigger, the circumference gets bigger, so ignorance gets bigger as well. So we need to drop some of these tropes, and that work goes back a long time. And then the final thing, on the point about nuclear and AI and biotech threats, or the magnitude you pointed to, I think, yeah, it's a conundrum, but for me, the democratic theme that we've centered around is, don't think of these things as things that are done to us by science and technology, that somehow just we discovered things in the world, and then we have to have these technologies because we discovered them. They're somehow inherent in nature. They're not. They're made, just like knowledge is made by us. So don't just look at fatalistically that we have to somehow deal with what comes at us. Let's talk more proactively. Democracy should be more ambitious. What futures do we want? What technologies do we want? We don't have to have trickle down from what the most powerful interests want. We can talk about that, and that's part of the democracy as well. Not just talking about risks from technologies, but the directions of technologies. And I think that's why the point of these discussions is so important.
Thank you all. I'll just add one very quick note on this that kind of links both to the nuclear and back to the kind of question of art, is that, one thing that we spoke about throughout the workshop is what types of risks are we willing to live with? What types of risks actually just become normalized to us? And we think that that's just, right, they're like air. They're just there. One of our colleagues talked about, kind of financial markets and the kind of creation of the stock market is this thing that just seems, it's like, well, this is just the way it is, right? And similarly, we can think about kind of the, possession of nuclear weapons, MAD being a kind of a framework for mitigating that is just, these are the conditions that we have, this is just the way it is. And I think that one thing that's very important is, and that really art does have a very crucial role here, is helping us
imagine different sorts of alternatives to kind of really push back, I think, very hard against the notion that the world that we have is the only one that we get. And to write that kind of the famous there is no alternative, and to really be able then to kind of say, well, are these really the risks we want to live with? And how do we imagine a different kind of world, a different sort of space? And I think there's a huge place of kind of for artistic imagination in helping us sketch a world in which certain risks that we have just kind of lived to tolerate and to regard as naturally occurring, that we show them to actually be susceptible to social forces, to democratic and collective management. So I think on that note, I will thank our whole panel, and I hope you will join me in thanking them.